So I mentioned last time that we would be looking at a paper by Rebecca Tuvel, which takes on some of the controversial issues that we were looking at last time. I didn't mean to suggest that she's going to take on the particular issue of sports, but rather that she's going to take on the particular issue of whether self-identification determining gender/sex is plausible. I should say that Rebecca Tuvel's paper has an interesting history. It's worth looking at. It was accepted in the most prominent feminist journal of feminist philosophy, a very, very good journal named Hypatia. Um, some activists, after the paper was accepted and published, protested, saying that the journal shouldn't have accepted the paper. Their arguments sometimes appealed to grounds of scholarship. When they did appeal to grounds of scholarship, I think the arguments were rather poor, but they sometimes appealed to straightforwardly political arguments. They said that the paper is politically pernicious, that is, it's nefarious, it harms trans women in particular, and thus shouldn't have been published. You can look up discussion of the history of the paper there. Tuvel herself suffered some pretty serious consequences from all of this blowback, professional and personal. Surprisingly, because she's someone who would typically be considered a strong ally to transgender women. But at any rate, here's the basic idea of the paper. So she explores a potential consequence of the view that self-identification determines gender and that gender is the same thing as sex. So we're going to just say, let's suppose that self-identification determines gender and that gender and sex are the same thing. We're going to call that view self-ID for gender plus sex, gender/sex. She argues as follows, that self-ID for gender/sex implies a corresponding thesis about race. That is, it implies a self-identification determines race membership too. And we can call that view self-ID about race. Instead of saying gender/sex over and over, I'm just going to say self-ID about gender, but it means /sex. If Tuvel's right, then we have to accept one of the following two arguments. This shouldn't have come out first, so ignore the stuff at the bottom. So here's premise one. So premise one is self-ID about gender implies self-ID about race. It's the same on both sides. On side one, on the left-hand side, we have this premise. It's not the case that self-ID about race is true. That is, what race group you are isn't determined by how you self-identify. Therefore, given premise one, self-ID about gender is also false. On side two, we affirm that self-ID about gender is correct, and then we're stuck with the conclusion that self-ID about race is correct. Now, why do I say stuck with the conclusion? It's because, like Tuvel herself, I share some discomfort with this line of argument. So Tuvel doesn't endorse either argument, and she expresses an inclination to deny premise one on both sides. Why? Well, she accepts that self-ID about gender is true. That is, she thinks that gender/sex is determined by self-identification. But she doesn't want to accept that self-ID about race is true. That is, she doesn't think that because Rachel Dolezal identified as black, that makes her black. But she tries to find so why does she assert one then? Why does she think one is true? Well, or I shouldn't say think it's true. Why does she advance a case for one? It's because she tries really hard to find a reason to reject one, and she fails. That is, every reason she can come up with to reject one, either a sort of broadly epistemic reason, a reason that may be truth-tracking, or a broadly moral reason, not to say that those can't be truth-tracking, but put it this way, either a broadly metaphysical reason or a broadly moral reason to reject one is implausible. So she tries over and over to find a reason, be it metaphysical or moral, to reject one, and she can't find a good one. And after being unable to find a good one, she realizes it looks like one is pretty well motivated, so she tentatively concludes that one is true, or at least that it requires a lot more exploration before we decide to reject it out of hand. And consequently, we're stuck with one of these arguments. And she doesn't like being stuck, because as I said, she wants to say that self-ID about gender is true, but self-ID about race is false. Okay. Obviously, one is the most interesting premise. I don't know why it disappeared on the left there. Maybe it'll come back. We're not going to run through Tuvel's case. If you're interested in this issue, I recommend reading the paper. But here's the basic idea. She agrees with Haslanger that we should choose our definitions to suit our goals. And then she says, for any goal that would lead to self-ID about gender, there's a comparable goal that would lead to self-ID about race. So premise 1, which again has disappeared from the left-hand side for some reason, on both sides is true. And as I say here, if you want to explore this further, you can read the essay, which is fairly easy to read. Tuvels writes pretty clearly. Okay, and we will stop there.